Please welcome Attorney General Ed Meese.
It's always an honor to be any place which is connected with Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis, as you all know, I'm sure, and that's why you're here, is one of the great American patriots. I'd like to talk about, as she pointed out, Ronald Reagan, for a number of reasons. First of all, as she pointed out, he was the greatest president in the 20th century and really is one of our all-time great presidents. But I think from the standpoint of you who are looking at the conservative movement today, he is a conservative president who showed that conservative ideas and conservative principles work. If you look at the conservative movement since World War II, the modern conservative movement, right after the end of the war, a lot of conservative scholars like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and other great names were worried about the drift of the world to socialism. And that's how they started writing and speaking about conservatism and conservative principles and the importance of free markets and that sort of thing. In those early days, conservatism was an intellectual movement. And then in the 1960s, as Mrs. Schlafly will remember, when Barry Goldwater ran for the presidency, he turned it into a political movement. And he recruited a lot of young people your age and others slightly older than that, into his campaign. And while he didn't win in 1964, he started this group of people who were conservative and understood what conservatism was all about. And so it became a political movement. And those were really the ground troops who were available then when Ronald Reagan ran for the presidency in 1976 and 1980. And Ronald Reagan, both as governor in the 1960s and 70s, and then as president in the 1980s, turned conservatism into a governing movement, where of course it has been since that time. And so that's why it's important to recognize the fact that Ronald Reagan showed that conservative principles worked. Now, how did he do that? Well, one of the things that you have to remember, I recognize that none of you probably were alive when he became president, and if you did, anybody who was here that was alive was more interested in Ronald McDonald than Ronald Reagan. But when Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, this country was in a deep recession. It was in a recession equally as bad, if not worse, than what we saw here in the 2008-2009 period. We had, for example, inflation rates of 12.5%. We had interest rates of 21%. We had an energy shortage. Mrs. Schlafly will remember that we had to get our cars in line at the gas station at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning because by 8:30 they'd sold all the gasoline they had for that day. And so we had a tremendous economic problem. At the same time, we had a serious international and national security problem. The Soviet Union was at its peak. They were literally subverting countries in our own hemisphere. They had a Marxist bastion in Nicaragua, which was subverting El Salvador and which was seeking to threaten other countries in Central America. We had mercenaries from Cuba going into Angola. We had the captive states of Eastern Europe were under Soviet domination. And so we had a serious international threat from the Soviet Union, while at the same time our military had seriously deteriorated in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And as a result of these problems, both at home and abroad, the attitude, the spirit of the American people was at an all-time low. People were concerned, they were doubting the ability of the United States to take its place of leadership in the world, of protecting our own people, protecting our interests overseas. So it was a serious time for the United States, and that's what Ronald Reagan faced when he became president on the 21st of January in 1981. And so it was in this situation that he remedied all of these three threats, at home, abroad, and among the people, using conservative principles. Now, what are these conservative principles particularly? A few of them that I wanted to mention are, first of all, the idea of freedom and individual liberty, and the commitment to freedom and the supremacy, if you will, the fact that freedom can overcome totalitarianism. He saw the captive nations of the world under the oppressive heel, if you would, of the Soviet Union. And he felt that to go on, as we had been up until that time, with essentially freedom and totalitarianism living side by side, the free world and the oppressed world. And he thought that that was the wrong way for the world to continue and that that could not go on. And so freedom was one of those principles. A second was limited government. He realized that the founders in the Constitution had prescribed a government limited to certain functions that the states and the people themselves could not do, and for which we needed a central government in order to deal with such things as national security, foreign policy, and the like. And so one of his objectives was to bring back the federal government into the bounds of the Constitution. A third principle was free markets, free enterprise. He recognized that too much the government had intruded into the way in which people went about their daily business, whether it was businesses, industry, workers, whatever it happened to be, that the federal government was intruding. And as a result of which, that was one of the main reasons why we had the economic problems that occurred and which he had to face at that particular time. A fourth principle was to renew the traditional American values that began with the founding fathers back in the 1770s, and which traditions, if you will, and values such as faith in God, such as the principle of individual liberty that I mentioned, about patriotism and dedication and loyalty to the country, and to control, and the idea that the people control the government. In other words, that principle that was in the Declaration of Independence, where it said that the only legitimate government is that which exists by the consent of the governed. And finally, the concept of a strong national defense. And the way you did this was to, first of all, deal with the economy. And so as a result, he lowered tax rates across the board. And this wasn't just a monetary or an economic principle, it was also a freedom principle. Because his belief was that the more of the money that people had earned that they kept for themselves, and that they then used in a way which was best for them and for their families, that this was far better than the Soviet way, for example, or even in those democratic countries which had high tax rates, where a majority of people's money went to the government and the government decided how to spend it. He felt that that the limited amount of money that was necessary for the true functions of government obviously could be sent in taxes, but that most of what people earn should be kept for them to dispose as an issue of freedom and individual liberty. Likewise, he had regulatory reform. He reformed and limited the amount of regulation that the federal government dealt with and eliminated a lot of unnecessary regulations which were strangling business and industry in our country, again, contributing to the recession. He also believed in and worked with the Federal Reserve to get a stable monetary policy. During the 70s, inflation, the reason for inflation was the way in which the monetary policy had fluctuated up and down for political reasons. And he felt that stable monetary policy was necessary so that people can count on that and the necessity of overcoming inflation. And finally, reducing the size and scope and cost and particularly of government spending. And this was an important part. Well, these were the principles that these were the actions, the strategies that he dealt with in dealing with our economic problems. And as a result, he ended those problems and started the longest period of economic growth in the history of the country. In terms of national security and foreign policy, again, he had a strategy. He engaged the Soviet Union on a moral plane. He felt that it wasn't just a matter of politics, it was a matter of morality, that people should not be consigned forever to oppression and captivity. And that's why he said, as he outlined his agenda for the free world, was that freedom and liberty would overcome communism and consign Marxism to the ash heap of history. And indeed, he set about to do that by taking on the Soviet Union as being essentially an immoral operation and an immoral aspect of foreign policy domination. He also built up our military strength so that we had the finest military force in the history of our country and in the history of any country. He strengthened our personnel in the military. He strengthened our equipment and materiel. He strengthened our military policies. And as a result, ultimately, as you know, that action in strengthening the military and dealing with the Soviet Union was such that we ended the Cold War by the end of essentially by the end of the 1980s, with the forces of freedom winning and with the West showing that freedom and liberty was superior to totalitarianism and Marxism. And the third thing he did, by talking with the people and stressing the founders' concept of America, a place in which freedom and opportunity and prosperity could be the way in which a democratic republic operated. The fact that he talked about people's faith, the fact that he himself illustrated the importance of government not restricting or interfering with people's ability to worship as they saw fit. The fact that he relayed, again, the importance of the history of our country, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, things such as this, those foundations of our patriotism. This brought about a change in the American spirit so that people once again had confidence in our government, in our limited government under the Constitution, and confidence in the fact that the people themselves could solve the problems, whether they be economic problems or foreign policy problems, and that America was on the march, was on the rise, and that American exceptionalism was in fact the way in which our country would go forward. Well, these were the kinds of things in which, again, he utilized these principles that I mentioned, such as a limited government, such as a strong national defense. Again, he talked a great deal, as I mentioned, about free markets. And so it was these principles that Ronald Reagan used in order to bring us back from the recession, from the economic and other problems that we faced at that particular time. And that's why these principles are important today, and why Ronald Reagan, as the man who showed that they worked, is an important figure as far as the conservative movement is concerned. One of the things that we need today is more emphasis upon the principles that Ronald Reagan showed were successful. And that's why it's important in the people that you've been talking with and will be talking with this afternoon and tomorrow, that we have these leaders in our Congress, such as many of those who've been invited to speak here. And it's important that you understand why these principles are the foundation on which our country was built by the founders, but is also how it has prospered over more than 2 centuries. And why, at the present time, the threats to these various principles are extremely important for us to recognize, as well as important to counter with the kinds of policies we have at all levels of our government. As we look today at the things that are happening to our country, the threats, for example, to freedom, being able to worship and enjoy their religious beliefs, the censorship that is taking place even by some of the departments of our government to people expressing their views of morality and of their religious views, the fact that we have more efforts by the federal government to interfere with and to contain and to essentially injure the free markets and our economic well-being in the country. The fact that we have today, even at a time of great stress in our country because of recent happenings in Florida, we have the federal government actually involved in stirring up people to rebel, if you will, and to take out their legitimate feelings, in some cases, against our society. All of these things indicate that we are at a flashpoint, if you will, at a crucial point in terms of the future and the history of this country. And that's why it's very important that the principles that Ronald Reagan espoused, the principles that are at the heart of the conservative movement in this country, be understood by people your age and by your colleagues, particularly in our institutions of higher learning. I want to thank all of you for the privilege of being with you today.
Well, thank you.